Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, March 2nd, 2006. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, in this week's episode, Andy Sparks of the Home Brewery in Fayetteville, Arkansas, joins us to talk about adjuncts. They're the ingredients that go into beer other than the big four: water, barley malt, hops, and yeast. They sometimes get a bad rap, but they can also add a lot of character and flavor to your beer. It's all in how you use them. Well, I've gotten a lot of good comments on Brian Warren's work from the International Mead Festival recap in our past episode. I think Brian did a great job, and some of you were inspired by the interviews with the mead makers to make some mead of your own, again or for the first time. And I've got to say that I'm wanting to make some mead as well. Well, it's been a while since I mentioned the Frapper map, but I continue to be amazed at the number of people who listen to this show and where you all are. Of course, not everybody who listens to the show has taken the time to put a pushpin on the Frapper map, but it's fun to see who has. I really appreciate all the good comments that have been posted on there, and I appreciate all the good feedback that I receive on a daily basis. I know there are plenty of things you could be spending your time doing, and I'm glad you're spending some time with us here on this show. I hope we can entertain you and provide you with some good information. I got an update from Rob in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. You may remember that Rob was the one I picked on for priming his bottles twice when they didn't appear to be carbonating properly. Rob says that he discovered that where he was storing his bottles in his basement was about 10 degrees colder than what he had expected, and that may have contributed to the slow carbonation rate. Rob says he's keeping an eye on the overprimed bottles, and he's going to have a few friends over to drink them up before they explode. I think that's a great idea. It sounds like a great excuse for a party. Macon from Toledo, Ohio, wrote in to try to get some information on an aroma that he seems to pick up from certain styles of beers. He's wanted to know what the aroma is because he wants to keep it out of his homebrews. Macon describes the odor as rotten watermelon or possibly tomato. He says he most often experiences the aroma in wheat beers and some Belgian beers, as well as the only lambic he's ever tried. Well, I asked Macon if the aroma could be described as banana. If so, he may be picking up on some of the fruity esters that are produced by some yeast strains and are also the product of fermenting at warmer temperatures. That banana or fruity aroma is appropriate for some styles, and I advised him to stay away from those styles in his own home brewing. I recommended styles that use clean fermenting yeasts like California or American ale yeasts. And you'd also want to be sure that your fermentation temperatures are well within the specs for that yeast strain as well. You don't want them too warm. Macon says he believes he may just have a sensitive nose, and he's going to have to stick with brewing styles that he knows he loves, at least for the time being: pale ales, IPAs, brown ales, and porters. Well, if you're going to stick with styles, I think those are good styles to stick with. It's what I usually tend to gravitate towards. One more thing before we get into our interview for this week. Rick over at BigFoamyHead.com has purchased a fancy steam injector for use in his all-grain brewing, and he's setting up a page on his site with pictures and details of his latest brew, along with the recipe that I gave him for Amarillo Ale. And I'll post a link to that page in the description of this episode on BasicBrewingRadio.com. And you may see it before listeners to Big Foamy Head get to see it. I think we get a preview link. And while we're on the subject of beer podcasts, I want to give a plug to the fine folks at Craft Beer Radio and Pacific Brew News Radio. They've been sending listeners this way, so I want to make sure to return the favor. One of these days, we all need to get in the same room and drink some beers. So be sure to listen to BigFoamyHead.com, CraftBeerRadio.com, PacificBrewNewsRadio.com, and, of course, BasicBrewing.com. And look for the new Basic Brewing video podcast. It should be coming out here pretty quick. Now on to our interview with Andy Sparks on adjuncts in beer. We asked Andy to bring us up to speed on some of the other ingredients of our favorite beverage. Well, Andy, welcome again to Basic Brewing Radio, and thank you for having us in your shop again.
Well, thanks for having me on. I love to do this, and as you know, you're always welcome down here.
Well, thanks. It's I brought you a special treat today. One of the six of our 6-pack IPA, our experimental beer that Steve and I made, on the stove, just 3/4 of a gallon worth of beer.
Right, that's an interesting idea. It's making small batch like that. Get to try a specific small recipe.
Get to experiment a little bit. Yeah, it's not exactly what I expected, but it's good.
Yeah, it's good. It's could be a little colder maybe, but that's not a problem with the beer or the brewer.
Well, it was in the car.
Yeah,
it's a long drive,
and it's okay. They don't need to be ice cold for me.
Well, let's talk about. We want to talk about the ingredients of beer other than the traditional ingredients of beer. And first of all, let's back up and tell us. Remind us what the traditional ingredients of beer are.
Okay, well, I think a lot of your listeners already know a lot about the beer brewing process, but let's just cover it again. The basic elements that go into making beer is water, hops, and the sugar from the barley plant or barley malt. Those three ingredients are the primary ingredients for beer. And in the old days, there was actually a German purity law that said those are the only things that were allowed to be in a beer. And that was called the Reinheitsgebot. I think that's pronounced correctly. I'm not sure. But the law was that you could only use those three things, and that was before they realized that yeast was the magic ingredient that made it all into the wonderful concoction we know and love as beer. But other than that, you can add other things to supplement the sugar component of your beer. Obviously, when you make beer, the sugar component, the barley malt, is converted into alcohol and carbon dioxide, and that's what makes beer so much fun to drink. But you can get alcohol from other sugar components, and when we add those to beers, we call that an adjunct, because we're adding it to the standard components that make up beer. And there's lots of adjuncts out there. The American brewers like to use two especially. They like to use rice and corn, the sugar from rice and corn, which would be dextrose. And it's a very, very simple form of sugar. Doesn't have a lot of flavor, ferments very readily, and it's very inexpensive, and that's how come the big major brewers use them. It's to drive costs down.
And that's a lot. When you say the word adjunct, to a lot of people, that's a dirty word.
Right. And when you refer to it the way the domestic brewers use them, I consider it kind of a dirty word too. That's not to say that I've never added rice to a beer. There are certainly times when you want to boost, let's say, the alcohol component without boosting the body component of your beer, and rice is an excellent way to do that. But you want to use that in moderation.
You don't want it to take over the
right.
flavor profile of
right.
beer.
And what it'll do is it thins it out and makes it very dry. So if that's another thing that you're trying to achieve is a very crisp, dry beer, you can try adding a rice as part of the component, and that'll dry it out quite a bit because it is so readily fermentable. But along those same lines, there's lots of other sources of fermentable sugars that you can use with your beers. Typically, new home brewers like to experiment with things like fruits, so blueberry or raspberry or peach. Those things go well in beers, and it's very popular to use them. A lot of times you'll see in brew pubs, they'll take their standard wheat beer and then they'll add some raspberry or blueberry to it, and they'll sell that as their second tier fruit flavored beer. And it's nice. It's nice and refreshing in the summer. But it's also kind of sweet and has flavor characteristics that most people don't really associate with beer. So it's kind of on the fence there. There's the traditional beer styles, and then there's the kind of offshoots of those, these kind of fun beers that use things like fruits and other things. But that too, you can also there's lots of other sugar sources you can use, like honey or date sugar or raisins. There's a Dogfish Head beer that they make that uses roasted green raisins to add some more fermentable sugars and also to give it some character. The Sam Adams Utopias uses maple syrup in theirs. So there's just if it provides a source of sweetness you could probably use it in your beer as an adjunct.
And there are sugars that you add to beer that are not fermentable, right?
That's very true. A lot of people, you talk about sugars, and you assume that because it's sweet that it'll ferment out. Well, there are sugars that actually don't taste sweet when you taste them, like lactose. Doesn't taste very sweet, but it's not fermentable by beer and wine yeast. And so lactose is a sugar derived from milk. It's called milk sugar, and sometimes they use it in some beer styles. The one that stands out to me is the milk stout. There's a couple different styles of milk stout produced in England, and they use this lactose to add body to the beer without adding any more real sweetness to the beer, because they don't want it to taste sweet. They just want it to be thicker and have more of a silky mouthfeel. So,
and then there's also maltodextrin.
Maltodextrin is exactly that. It is a form of sugar. It does come from both corn and barley, but it is a form of sugar that is non-fermentable. And we use that a lot in the home brew business when we're making kits, because sometimes with extract you can't get the correct body that you're trying to get. If you're trying to make a beer that's especially thick-bodied, like stouts, especially the bigger stouts, not the dry stouts, but the more robust stouts, you need to thicken it up a little bit, and that's difficult to do just by adding malt extract. You'd have to add so much malt extract that the beer would be abnormally sweet from malt extract. So what we do is we add a little of this non-fermentable maltodextrin, and that will add some body to the beer without boosting the alcohol content abnormally.
And when would you add the maltodextrin?
We add it just with the regular extracts at the start of the boil. Mm-hmm. So we stir it in, because you want to pasteurize it just like anything else that's in your batch of beer.
Now, I've gotten an email, or I've traded emails with someone who was asking me about the details of the instructions of a kit that he bought. And I was assuming that because it was from a reputable dealer that the kit instructions were correct. But the instructions were, with that kit, to add the maltodextrin along with the priming sugar at bottling time. And I had not heard of that.
Well, technically I guess that would work, but I would think that, one, it's non-fermentable, so it shouldn't matter that it's in with the rest of the fermentables. It should stay in the beer. And two, if you add it at the bottling time, unless you do something to pasteurize it and make sure it's clean and sanitary before you add it to your beer, you run the risk of whatever came from the maltodextrin plant, and they bag it up. You just don't know what's airborne there. Just like maltodextrin, we boil that for a reason. One of which is to make sure that anything that was living in it is dead. So
I don't know the specifics of the instructions with the kit, but I would assume that you would boil it with your priming sugar at the same time,
right,
and then add it into the.
I assume that's what they intended for this guy to do as well. Would be to when you do the priming step, at least I know for our kits, our suggestion is to boil a cup of water in the microwave in a Pyrex dish, along with your 3/4 cup of priming sugar. Let that come to a full rolling boil, and then I usually suggest to let it sit for a few minutes, and then pour it into your bottom of your bottling bucket and rack your finished beer on top of it. That's just our technique. It works pretty well, but I assume what they were going to have this guy do is add his maltodextrin to that mix and to pasteurize it as well.
Yeah, it would be good to do that. What about strategies for using these other adjuncts? Say if you were to use honey, say.
Okay. Honey is kind of unique because it has very delicate aroma characteristics. So we would probably tend to look towards the mead makers for ideas on how to preserve those aromas and characters. So what we would probably do with honey would be to add it near the end of the boil so that it basically can just steep and pasteurize. Now I've made some meads that called for boiling the water and honey mixture, but boiling it at a very mild simmer kind of, not a rolling heavy boil like we typically do for home brews, which is an essential step in home brewing. The mead makers tend to simmer it for maybe 15 minutes at the most. Anything more than that is probably too aggressive for most mead makers. Some won't even use heat at all, and they'll simply use chemicals to pasteurize, or to, I shouldn't say pasteurize, to eliminate any wild yeast from their meads. So what I would say for somebody adding honey would be add it near the end, maybe even at the end of the boil. Turn the heat off, pour it in, and stir it up and dissolve it, and then let it sit for 10-15 minutes at that temperature before applying your chiller and getting it cold. The same sort of idea is the same for delicate fruits that you want to use. When I make a fruit beer, what I usually do is I start with a light base beer that doesn't have a lot of overpowering flavors, not especially hoppy, not especially rich in malt character, but something that is going to be a good foil or a good background for the fruit. Because the only point in putting the fruit in the beer is to taste it in the finished beer.
Which is why wheats are probably a good
foil for
palette.
Exactly.
To paint on with
right. So what I usually do is I will do the primary fermentation on a base beer, and then I will take the beer, and when I go to move it into the secondary, I'll take a little bit of the beer out of the primary, let's say maybe 1 or 2 quarts. I'll put it in a saucepan with my fruit, and I bring it up to what I consider to be pasteurizing temperature, around 170 degrees, and I let the fruit kind of steep in this hot water, this hot wort, for 10, 15, 20 minutes. Then I put that in the bottom of the secondary fermenter, and I rack all the beer from the primary on top of this fruit. And what you get there is a very, very quiet, mild fermentation, kind of more like if you had a glass of 7-Up or something on the counter, and you can see it just kind of teems, bubbles kind of come out of solution slowly and not aggressively. If you've ever made a batch of beer, you know what I mean when I talk about aggressive fermentation. Yeah. Beers typically foam up quite aggressively and blow off a lot of smells. And what you want to try and do is, on the fruit side, is keep those smells and aromas in your beer by not having them go into that, into the primary. The primary will, in essence, scrub all the aromas out of your fruit and blow them out of the airlock. And if you can smell them coming out of the airlock, you're not getting that smell in your beer. So.
Now, I've also heard that if you're using fruit in a mead, there's a specific conversation about mead. If you freeze your fruit before you use it, the freezing actually breaks down the cell walls of the fruit, and then it enables you to use it more readily in the process.
That's an excellent point. The thing about fruit is it's pretty hard to get the goodness out of the fruit if you were just to take cherries or something and try to smash them. And they don't smash easily. And but you're right. By freezing your fruit, it causes the ice crystals shred the skins and the cell walls. And I mean, if you've ever had a bag of frozen raspberries or something, open it up, you can see they're basically disintegrating in the bag. So I would suggest that. Pretty much any kind of fruit that you're going to use. I mean, obviously some fruits that's not as necessary, like, if you're going to do raisins or something, you just want to chop them up and then let them soak in warm water to kind of let them release their sugars.
Well, speaking of sugars, what about the Belgian candy sugars, or there's even, I believe now in some kits that you sell, instead of honey, you're actually using the granulated honey sugar, right?
Right. We have found a supplier that sells a granulated honey for use in baking products and some other things. And we found that for our honey wheat beer, it's just much more efficient for us to use a dry form of honey because it doesn't have that water weight in it.
It's still way good.
Right. It still has all that honey character, and it is basically made of honey. It's just been dehydrated. So it works good for us. But, I tell a lot of people, nowadays you see honey in lots of beers. And I tell people, a lot of times it's just enough honey so they can put the name honey on the wheat beer. It's, a cup of honey to 5 gallons of beer. You can't taste it, but it's in there, and you can call it a honey wheat beer. because it just adds a little romance to the name or something. It's just kind of a gimmick. But if you enjoy meads, you might want to try making some beers with a strong honey component. But I would say learn what mead tastes like, because fermented honey is not just like honey. It's very different. It's very interesting, but it is different.
You're telling that story reminded me that when I was talking to Chris Milam, brewing a batch, or watching him brew a batch, he was doing all the work at the brew pub. He said that he was talking about oatmeal stouts, and he said that a lot of breweries will brew a stout and then take a handful of oatmeal and throw it in there and call it an oatmeal stout, because oatmeal gets so sticky in the mash that just a little bit is enough to legally, I guess, call it oatmeal stout.
And that's one of those things. As a homebrew shop owner, I see a lot of people that want to make an oatmeal stout, and that really you can't make an oatmeal stout unless you're going to go to the all grain level, or at least the partial mash level. Oats are not converted; they're completely starch. And so quick oats, or even the rolled oats that we sell, they've been pre-gelatinized, which means they've been prepared for using in the mashing process. In essence, they'll become gooey and jelly-like as soon as you get them in hot water. Just like oatmeal, it's gummy and stuff. And it needs to be in that state, gelatinized, before it can be, the starches in it can be converted into sugars. So I see people sometimes make an extract batch of beer and of stout with the intention of throwing some hops in it. Some oats in it to make an oatmeal stout. And while it will work, if it was a light colored beer, you would see the effect of this raw starch in your beer. But since it's a black stout, you don't see the fact that it's got unfermented proteins from the starches from the oats in there. It still gives it a silky feel. I think that's what they're looking for, is that oats tend to add a silky character to oatmeal stouts, and so that's what they're looking for. And they can get some of that, but technically they're not converting the sugars, which they should be doing.
Now, do oats have enzymes of their own, or are they relying on the enzymes from the grain?
Well, I say no. I don't think so. They are. Almost everything that we add to a mash is going to depend on the enzymes in the barley. If we add wheat malted wheat doesn't have a husk anymore, so it doesn't have any enzymes. So it requires you to mash it with a grain like 2-row or 6-row that has enzymatic power. Almost everything, like I said, that needs to be converted, corn, rice, oats, will need to have the enzymatic power of your grain to get the work done. Other things you can get pre-converted. You can actually get rice in a extract form. It's a powder. You can get corn in its sugar form. That's called dextrose, and that's what we prime beer with. So you can get forms of these sugars in their simple form, so you can simply add them. But some things, when they're in their grain form, or in their raw state, they must be converted before you can make beer out of them.
Now, a lot of home brewers. Do you see a lot of home brewers coming into your shop and saying, I want to make a beer as high in alcohol as possible? And, is that, especially when people start home brewing, is that why they go to the adjuncts, and is that why they start adding?
Yeah, you get a couple different kinds. The people that really just are beer lovers and what they want is delicious beers like the ones they've tried in the world. And then other people that are simply looking for an economical way to make beer that is either cheaper or has a bit more kick than the beers they're used to. I think most people, though, after they get into the hobby, they tend to lean towards the first one. They tend to learn to love beer and like all the different components. But you're right. A lot of times when they first come in, they're looking, if I make beer, what can I do to make it better? And usually when you're young and naive, sometimes the answer is make it stronger.
Yeah.
But then that's not to say that I certainly haven't had some beers in the last week that are wonderful examples of American breweries making wonderful beers, and they're off the charts as far as alcohol concentration. So, it's funny because I do think of young homebrewers as the ones that tend to be aggressive at their, as far as how much malt they put in their beers. But nowadays, some of the big American brewers, are experimenting with beers that are just over the top as far as malt and hops and everything. So.
Yeah, Dogfish being one of them.
Yeah, Dogfish. I had the Avery barley wine the other day. Another 10% beer, and
the Sierra Nevada barley wine's available here in Northwest Arkansas now.
Yeah.
Wow.
So many good beers, so little time.
And the time goes quicker when you're drinking the beers.
That's for sure.
This little beer, this little 6-pack IPA has 8.6% alcohol.
Wow,
so,
that's quite a bit.
And it's it's a very select.
And it's gone.
It's one beer closer to extinction. Well, shall we move out of the realm of fermentables and into other additives to beer that are not, as you classify them, adjuncts, because they're not fermentable.
Right.
But one of the most popular is Irish moss, which is not a moss at all, is it? No,
it's actually a seaweed. It's a seaweed that's gathered off the coast of Ireland near a town called Carrageen. It's also called Carrageen moss or Carrageenan when you find it in things like ice cream. It's actually what it is it's a natural form of gelatin, basically. You can take this seaweed. It's prepared in a very special way. They go and gather it, they rinse and clean it, and then they dry it on screens, and then they crumble it, and then usually when they make it and use it in the food industry, they will rinse it again and then cook it. And when they do that, it extracts basically like a jelly from it, and they use that as a thickener for soups and also for like dairy products. Ice creams are often have carrageenan in them. But what we use it for is a clarifier. There's a couple different things that I think it does to make it work. One is it has the way it is positively charged, or the way it is charged, tends to draw proteins to it. But also the fact that it is like gelatin, and that's another also used as a clarifying agent. It tends to drag, it tends to fall to the bottom, and it tends to drag all the things that it touches with it. So what happens is these proteins are clinging to it because of their positive and negative, their attraction. But also it's kind of sticky and heavy. And what you'll find in the bottom of your fermenter, when you get done, if you use Irish moss, is little clumps of kind of jelly on the bottom of your brew pot, and that's dragging some of the impurities out of your beer.
Some of the proteins,
right, that will cause chill haze and stuff later on. Now, it's not a magic bullet. Only about a teaspoon is all you need to 5 gallons. They've done exhaustive studies. I read there's kind of a lot of work done on this. But using more than the specified amount does not do any good. It doesn't help. And what you can actually do is you can end up with some of the kind of seaweedy taste. Because if I open up I have it in a tub, a big tub, of Irish moss. If we open that up, it smells like you're at the beach. It definitely does.
Smells like the beach.
Right. So just use the amount that's specified and what I do is I pour the size of about a quarter in the palm of my hand. I don't measure it, but I just about a tablespoon and throw it in the batch. I usually add it at the last 5 to 10 minutes. It's not super important. It needs to cook for a little while to get it to its jelly-like state. So you want it to be in there for at least 10, 15 minutes, something like that. But it's not super important, just at the end of your batch.
I had a question the other day. Someone emailed me and asked if it was important to rehydrate or to hydrate the Irish moss.
Well, in essence, that's what you're doing when you throw it in the brew pot. It's gonna cook and swell up and become gelatinous, which is the way it needs to be to work its magic.
That was basically my answer. Is it's dry now, but when you toss it in the brew pot, it's going to get wet pretty quick.
Right. Unlike yeast, it's a different thing, and you're rehydrating that And that is a step that a lot of people do with dry yeast, and especially if you're making bread with yeast, you want to rehydrate it.
It's a living organism.
Right.
Though.
And it's actually waking it up from its dormant state and letting it have a chance to kind of open its eyes, stretch its legs, and yawn before you throw it into its job and make it do the work that you're going to have it do in your beer.
What else? What other yeast nutrient is another not an adjunct, but something else you'd add to the beer?
Depending on the kind of beer you're making, some beers have less of the nutrients that yeast like. But typically beer, malt extract, and beers made with malt extract have plenty of nutrient in them. The malt extract itself contains lots of the things that yeast like besides the sugar. They need a few other things, some vitamins basically to keep them running at peak efficiency. But sometimes if you're making beers with a high honey content, because it doesn't have especially a lot of nutrients for yeast. Meads almost always include some yeast nutrient. But a beer that is high in rice, like if you're trying to make something that's very similar to a domestic light beer or something, and you're driving the rice content up, I would suggest adding a little yeast nutrient as well to give it a little extra edge.
Higher gravity beers as well?
Higher gravity beers as well. What happens to them is that they have plenty of nutrient, but at the end of the yeast's life cycle, near the end of the fermentation, they start to run out of the ability to keep working. As a matter of fact, I think that you did an excellent show on yeast and how to get the best out of making high gravity beers. So I'd defer to that episode for that for sure.
See the archives.
Look for the archives.
Look for the Dave Logston episodes.
Yeah, those were good.
I need to go back to those every now and then. But there's also, if you want to change the characteristics of your water, there are also ingredients that you can add to do that.
Right. We carry something called Burton water salts, which is a little proprietary mix of salts and some chemicals to harden the water to make it like the water that's at Burton-on-Trent.
We've got listeners there, by the way.
Do we?
Yeah.
Famous brewing city in the world for sure. And you know, if you're going to make a pale ale, a British pale ale, and you want it to come out as close to the true British versions of those beers, hardening up your water a little bit is the way to do it. There's a few different chemicals, I've seen at other stores. There's heading salts, which will, by adding those, tend to give your beer a little more of a foamy head. So there's a lot of different little things that you can do like that. When you're making all grain too, there's gypsum, calcium carbonate, things that you can use to change the pH of your sparge water to get the most extraction when you're doing all grain brewing. But on that, you're starting to get into the detail, some of the
highly technical stuff.
Right. And then that's where I would probably, point you to your local homebrew shop. If you have a specific thing you're trying to do, let's say you're trying to make a beer that is of a specific style, go to your homebrew store and say, I want to make this style. What can you do to help me make it as close to that as possible? They'll probably put you on a liquid yeast that's like the kind from that area, and they may, like I said, give you some chemicals to harden up your water to make it like there. Or, maybe instruct you to get water that's especially soft, and because there are some beers from some areas where the water's softer. So,
but for a beginning brewer, if I get questions about water, I say make it with the water you've got, or buy some drinking water and make your beer. And if you like it, don't worry about the chemicals.
Right.
But if there's something that's a little off, talk to your local homebrew store guy, because he probably is brewing with the same water,
right,
and is facing the same challenges.
The best advice is if your water tastes good to drink, it's probably fine to brew with.
Mm-hmm.
You still have to worry about the chlorine content, because I don't know of a whole lot of places in America that don't have chlorine in their water. So you're still going to have to work that out. But as far as quality of water, as long as it's good to drink and taste good, then you should be able to make good tasting beer with it.
So what do you think? Have we covered at least? Probably
not. I'm sure your listeners will say, why didn't you cover this?
Yeah, what about XYZ ingredient? You didn't talk about that.
We were saving that for the next podcast.
Yeah. And, if there's other stuff out there that we haven't talked about, or if you want to learn about more stuff in detail, send me an email. Maybe the next time Andy and I get together, we can dig into it a little deeper.
For sure.
But I appreciate your time, Andy. I appreciate your having me here at the store.
No problem. We appreciate you, James.
Thanks a lot. Thanks again to Andy Sparks for all his help and advice. You can visit Andy's store online at thehomebrewery.com. That's thehomebrewery.com. I'm working on an interview with Tess and Mark Samatulski, authors of Beer Captured and Clone Brews. And I hope to have that next week. And I'm looking forward to talking to them. That should be fun. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say hey, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And if you're wanting to get into home brewing, while you're on our site, you can check out our DVD, Basic Brewing, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing. We walk you through the process step by step. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVD. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online. And stay tuned for our all-grain DVD coming soon. Well, that's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time. So long.